Welcome to Genuine Life Recovery. We're here to help you and your loved ones overcome addictions and other addiction-related mental health challenges. In this show, we dive into the physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual aspects of addiction, mental health, recovery, family dynamics, codependency, and more. You can listen on your favorite app or at jodystevens.org. Genuine Life Recovery is made possible by great friends like Joshua's Heart in memory of Joshua Brent Moore, bringing hope, love, and awareness to those afflicted by addiction, online at joshsheart.org, and Jody Stevens Productions for commercial voiceover, narration, production, MC, and public speaking, online at jodystevens.org. So we're talking with Rocky Herron. So Rocky spent 31 years with the DEA investigating drug trafficking at local, national, international levels. He's got a master's degree in education and now uses that experience to show students the true impact of addiction and substance abuse, not only on the individual, but also the trickle effect, right? Where it's impacting families, schools, cities, nations, the global community. So amazing work that you're doing, Rocky. Thanks for joining us today.
No, thanks for the invitation and the chance to talk.
Yeah. So from DEA to drug abuse prevention ambassador, I feel like that's a great transition, but kind of what inspired it all? The 2-minute version.
It's accidental, really. I never dreamt I'd be doing anything in education. And in 2007, my daughters were 9 and 7 and 5, and a little older than that. But I discovered that there wasn't any kind of organized prevention education in our schools. And I was surprised. I remember the DARE days, and I assumed that the schools were doing something to teach our kids. And in 2007, I was investigating the OxyContin epidemic, and I was dealing with all these really just absolutely destroyed young people and grieving families. And I was shocked to learn our schools weren't doing anything about drug education. So I came up with a little program, what I thought I'd like my kid and her friends to know. And I did it in her 5th grade class, and didn't expect it to go anywhere, but by word of mouth, more invitations and more invitations. And then by the end of my DEA career, it was really almost my full-time job was sharing my DEA experiences with the kids to show them, as you mentioned, what drugs do to individuals and families and our country and the greater world. So last year, I just said 31 years is enough of chasing the bad guys. And I jumped over to a local school district in San Diego that has freed me up to go out and engage any school, club, community group that I'm able to access with its information.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for what you're doing. So you were in the DEA during the whole Oxy thing. So were you involved in investigating Purdue Pharma and all that stuff?
I was local in San Diego, and
Okay.
in the 10 years I was in, we have a specialized unit called Tactical Diversion Squad. And when I was in that
Yeah.
unit, I arrested 6 doctors over the years and put them
Oh
in
my
jail, which,
gosh.
people think, oh, big deal. You don't understand. A doctor does not want to go to jail. Your average drug
Right.
at some point will give up and accept going to jail. The doctors don't. So doing an criminal investigation on a doctor is actually quite challenging work. And I really,
Mhm.
and then we would go after their DEA registration and their medical license at the
Yeah.
time. And these are people who are harming patients for money or for sex or, to feed whatever perverted motives they had. So, yeah. And I dealt with the first generation of grieving parents in 2000
Mm.
to 2010. And sadly, I'm dealing with a whole other generation of grieving parents now because of the fentanyl problem.
Oh my gosh. So you were kind of more going after the doctors that had the kind of the drug mills and stuff like that, it sounds like. Because I remember that whole thing where people would just go get it through these doctors where you could get whatever you wanted. It was different than sort of the regular medical doctor. I think they were calling them drug pill mills or something. What
Pill
was that?
pill mills,
The
yeah,
whole
pill mills. I mean,
Yeah.
there were a couple. Most of it was just for financial reasons. They would charge
Yeah.
cash for the office visit, and they would make the patient give some bogus pretext for needing a big prescription of
Got it.
opioids.
Yeah.
And some were really bad people. Some were really,
Yeah.
really bad. Sex offending doctor would drug the patients and do things to them. So they ran the
Yeah.
gamut. But most doctors, 99% of doctors, are really fine people, and they're trying to navigate a complicated world of patients demanding drugs and not getting
Yeah.
reimbursements and things. So part of what I did was I developed really tight relationship with our medical community in San Diego, and I helped train them on what drug seeking behavior is and how to kind of harden their practices. And one of the things I would look for, if someone would give me a tip that a certain doctor was writing too many prescriptions, we wouldn't just run out and arrest the person.
Yeah.
We'd start looking at, how are they prescribing? Who are their patients?
Hmm.
And that was interesting because, of course, people in addiction speak to each other. And one
Yeah.
of the things I discovered very quickly, if a doctor's doing the wrong thing, they would have a very large percentage of patients who had previous convictions for drug offenses. And that wasn't the case, but that was an indicator that that doctor might be a little bit lax on the medical side of the need for prescribing.
Yeah, and it was such a complicated time, we have a doctor that works for us, and he went through addiction, got sober, and I've had quite a few doctors on the show that went through that, but then they would also say, during that time, we were supposed to treat pain, and we were and if you didn't treat pain, then they would go somewhere else, and then so it's like you're always at this ebb and flow of what the medical community is doing. Now everybody's cracking down. Well, maybe next year they won't, you know what I mean? And so but a lot of these doctors were, they got sober, they got their license revoked, they got sober, and now some of them are working in the addiction field. But just like the whole show Dope Sick, they ended up getting hooked too. So it was just it was a big messy time, and it sounds like we're a little bit back there again with this fentanyl craze, but it looks different, of course.
Well, the whole fentanyl, I was in the middle of this. I saw the transition from OxyContin to roxicodone, and from
Mhm.
oxycodone to fentanyl. And, the prescription drug epidemic of OxyContin did kick it off.
Yeah.
Most of the
Yeah.
people that I was investigating were actually addicted to Vicodin. I mean, that 40 to 50 Vicodin a day was common in the people
Oh my
I
god.
was chasing for doctor shopping. But I saw the transit when we reformulated OxyContin and made it harder to abuse. There was an instant shift to roxicodone. And then when the cartels in Mexico saw how much money Americans were spending on roxicodone, that's what they decided to fake. So the reason that the blue pill has become so prevalent in the fentanyl world is that was the most sought after prescription drug at the time the cartels got into the business of faking the medicines.
Oh my gosh. So, okay, so 31 years DEA. What percent of illegal drugs are smuggled versus manufactured here?
Oh, today 98%. I mean, if you're talking about marijuana, I mean, it's California's legal and for medical and
Right.
recreational purposes. So there's not a whole lot of marijuana smuggling anymore. But yeah, everything we do in drug law enforcement has intended and unintended consequences. And when we did the Control Meth Act years ago to control pseudoephedrine, and you have to go behind the counter now at a pharmacy to get it.
Yes.
We successfully tamped out most methamphetamine production here in the U.S. But the consequence of that was it moved to Mexico. And
Okay.
studies I've read say that as much as 30% of Mexico is not under the control of the government. So there's vast swaths of Mexico that now have these massive industrialized methamphetamine laboratories
Oh my
producing a tidal
gosh.
wave of this
Yeah.
stuff. And then when they discovered how Americans wanted fentanyl, then it was very easy for those chemists in Mexico to shift to also producing fentanyl. So not
So,
a lot of the hard drug production is happening in the U.S. anymore.
oh my goodness. So you travel to Mexico a lot. What's kind of going on there? I mean, I've been there a few times. I've been to Guatemala, things like that. I mean, it's pretty dangerous, and it's I mean, there's just a lot of corruption. So a lot of law enforcement maybe is sort of involved in the whole drug smuggling, right? I mean, what kind of in a nutshell, what's happening there with illegal drugs, and then maybe China too? Because I mean, that gets me to a question about the myths and what's really happening. Because there's a lot of talk now. Well, it's made in China and it's coming in through Mexico and it's warfare, or I mean, there's just so many different things with regards to this. I'm talking about like fentanyl and what I don't. That was like a 5-part question.
No, that's okay. No,
Mexico,
look,
what's happening?
I had a good career in DEA. I got in trouble a lot with management because when I believe something, I speak that. I
Yeah.
didn't give in to the bureaucracy and what people wanted me to say. And
Hmm.
now I'm a bit of a contrarian. And our
Yeah.
national policy is and remains pointing the finger. We point the finger at Mexico and blame them for fentanyl. We point the finger at China and we
Right.
point the finger at Colombia. And we all this death here, and we just point the finger. Problem
Hmm.
is, it's Americans choosing to buy this stuff. So yes, Mexico and Colombia and China need to do a lot more, but it's Americans who are financing all that violence. And the death toll for police in Mexico is horrifying.
Oh
And
wow.
what I don't understand in our society, we don't want to talk about it's the individual American drug user that's financing that. And people, I know a lot of people who are really pushing this whole let's go to war with the cartels, let's declare them terrorist organizations. And I'm a little confused by that one because they're not
Hmm.
going to take that lying down. I mean, if we
Right.
start treating them like military targets, they're going to fight back. And there's tens or hundreds of thousands of retired Americans living in Mexico. All the cartels have
Hmm.
huge numbers of their soldiers all spread throughout the U.S. So I think going to war with the cartels is going to be a lot messier than it sounds. But I also think it's a little bit incoherent. If we're not going to try at least as hard to get Americans to stop buying the stuff,
Right.
I don't really see how we can justify, changing, our tactics and going after these other countries in a very violent way. And I happen to believe as long as there's demand, there's going to be somebody making and selling the drug. If we were magically able to eradicate drug production and trafficking in Mexico, then somebody somewhere else would step up to feed that demand of millions of Americans spending billions of dollars a year on these substances.
It is so complicated as to what to do. Are you one of those people that feels like just legalize it and then let
No,
supply
no,
and demand?
absolutely not. No, no,
Oh,
no,
okay.
no. And you're working in addiction. When you meet people who have lost themselves to methamphetamine or to fentanyl,
Mhm.
I have no notion of legalizing that stuff, and
Mhm.
and there's no political. So even the conversation was a little bit, philosophical. There's no political will
Yeah.
to legalize. So we have to deal with the reality. What can we do now? And there is a solution, and it's education. And
Yeah.
the role model
Yeah.
I'll use is cigarettes. When I was a young man, starting in elementary school, I was educated every year on the harm of cigarette smoking,
Mhm.
and it was sometimes laughable training, but we got it regularly. And after 30 or 40 years, Jody, we won that because we convinced American teenagers not to want cigarettes. American kids today, as a generation, do not want them. And of course, the tobacco companies have produced the vapes to meet that demand. But now, when we're looking at this hideous drug crisis, it's not for me. It's not just fentanyl; it's the super potent marijuana and the meth and everything else that's
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah. Mhm.
We're not talking about education at all. Find me a national leader. I challenge you. Find me a national leader who actually talks about the need to do some kind of coherent prevention plan. We don't. We talk about treatment and harm reduction, which are very important for people who are already sadly on that path of personal destruction. And we
Mhm.
talk a lot about more law enforcement resources and a lot of conversation about this make the cartels terrorists. And nobody that I'm aware of, and I'm trying to pay attention, nobody's
Yeah.
talking about getting in the schools and teaching our kids year after year after year in a coherent and effective way that this is too dangerous to mess with this stuff. So that's what I do. I've done
Yeah.
108 presentations in San
Mm.
Diego since July 1st. I've done about 20 more in Mexico and Guatemala in the same time frame. And I talk to as many kids as I can, and I show them the reality. This is what happened to other beautiful people just like you who
Yeah.
thought they could get away with using this stuff. You can't do it.
Mhm. That's awesome. I love that you're doing that. I've been to Guatemala a couple times. I love it there. I don't know what it is. It's a great place. I would love to go back, for sure.
Well,
Um,
it's interesting. Guatemala is Mexico's southern neighbor,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
was talking to high school kids, and in some of my assemblies, the local authorities would come. It was an extraordinary thing for me to the State Department to bring me in to these rural
Mhm.
communities, and the local medical authorities would come, and one the regional like the state medical director had
Mhm.
never heard of fentanyl. And he started
Oh,
crying
wow.
when I was sharing my presentation, and he came up afterwards and said, "Rocky, we have all sorts of people dying, and we can't figure out why this
Oh my
unexplained death."
gosh.
And it may very and this happened in San Diego, Jody, when
Yeah.
we started finding all the people dying from OxyContin in San Diego, and we were learning about these deaths through our investigations, and the
Mm.
informants were telling us somebody died on Oxy or their friends. The medical examiner was not testing for Oxy. So there was this disconnect between the medical
Yeah.
examiner was finding and what we were hearing about. And so what we figured out is it could be that this huge tidal wave of fentanyl that Mexican cartels are pushing north into the United States, it's logical that some of that's also finding its way south. But the authorities in Guatemala are completely they haven't even heard of it, much less have the means to test for it.
Right, exactly, because sometimes, like you said, it's we always I went in there with a organization called Food for the Poor, which is almost like the Red Cross there, but it was also similar type of a situation where a lot of times it was just a simple shot or a $1 thing that they just needed to figure it out, to prevent, the swelling of the head through malnutrition and all those sorts of things, but I think I love what you're doing in schools because I think kids are hungry for it. I really do. I think they're hungry for authenticity and education on what's really going on. A friend of mine does school education on just self defense and also just mindfulness and things like that. Because a lot of prevention is just, home life prevention, trauma prevention. I've lost most of my family to addiction. And, so I recognize a lot of the underlying disorders and issues as well. And so we've got to work on healing ourselves as well and our families because that's really one of the biggest preventions as well, don't you think?
Oh no, it is the biggest. I mean, what is behind this drug crisis is the untreated mental health crisis, which is massive. And what's
Yeah.
causing the mental health crisis, the breakdown of the family,
Yep.
societal disaffiliation, the
Yeah.
overload of information, the disconnect happening through social media. So there's massive tectonic shift going on in our fundamental structure of our society, and
Yeah.
more. And it's the CDC came out with the data earlier this year that was terrifying. I mean, they surveyed kids nationwide, and the CDC found that 44% of American teenagers self-identify as persistently sad and hopeless. And I still
Hmm.
find that hard to believe.
Yeah.
44% of the teenagers in the United States of America, richest country in the history of the world, self-identify
Yeah.
as persistently sad and hopeless. And how that didn't cause a national crisis, Jody, I don't know. But what it means is that approximately half of our teenagers are really hurting. And
Mm.
the phones have changed how they communicate with each other. A lot of teenagers don't even really know how to communicate,
Yeah.
carefully with their friends. And then social media has taught them you don't share your negative stuff. And so we have a larger population of kids more hurting than ever, less able to communicate amongst each other, and less willing to communicate. And so they're carrying around all this pain, the
Yeah.
anxiety, the depression, the low self esteem, the bullying, the
Yep.
isolation. And guess what happens? They go to the party, and their jackass friend hands them something, says, "Look what I got, let's do this." And they're completely unprepared to understand what the substance is. And when I would arrest the drug dealers, I would ask them lots of impertinent questions. And one was, how do you get people to try this stuff? And the line I heard over and over again, to a drug dealer would go to a teenager and say, "I want you to try this." And the kid would go, "I don't want to use it." And they would go, "It's just like marijuana, but better. It's just like marijuana, but better." And these teenagers would go, "Oh, okay." And they would snort an oxy, or burn an oxy on a foil or something. And then the kids would tell me, "Rocky, once I smoked it, I was done." And I argue with people in the scientific field all the time. And obviously, medical addiction is something that happens over time. Nobody gets addicted medically after one use.
Right.
But the power
Exactly.
of smoking an oxy, and I had people tell me the same thing about crack cocaine, and I'm assuming it's the same now with fentanyl, that it's so potent that for
Yeah.
some people, once they use it the first time, they're hooked psychologically. There's nothing else in their life that's going to help them escape from that pain the way that those chemicals will. And then we
Yeah.
have a terrible problem in our hands.
Oh my gosh. And you know what I hear over and over from people in recovery? Like, I've been sober for 16 years.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. My husband's got 20, but not from opiates, it was alcohol and marijuana. I grew up in Alaska, so that was pretty much in the 80s what was happening there. But with fentanyl is it's a similar type of a thing where we lie to ourselves and say that we can handle it. But what I find with a lot of these, a couple of guys that I've had on is they say, you know, I was a big dude or I'm a big dude. The people that are dying are kids. I can handle it. I can
Mm.
handle it. People, they have low tolerance. And then pretty soon, after they've gotten sober, they'll look at me and be like, I couldn't handle it. Like that fentanyl, I couldn't handle it. I had this big dude on who, I mean, he's like, I just did a little bit and my semi was across the road. I woke up, in jail. I don't remember anything. And this is like just a tiny little bit of fentanyl. And it was the same story. It was, I thought I could handle it.
Right. And then, the people would tell me, but I found what I've been looking for. And that was a refrain I heard all the time from these poor people that had destroyed their lives. I found what I've been looking for when I started using it. And I educate the
Yeah.
kids. It's basic stuff. I mean, I meet the kids where the kids are. I don't talk at them, I talk to them. And one of the things I'll point out is, we all have an individual thumbprint, and the kids all understand that. And I
Yeah.
say, your brain chemistry is as unique to you as your thumbprint is, right? If psychiatry were an easy profession, they wouldn't make all the money they do. Psychiatry is a mystery because everybody's brain works differently and reacts differently
Yeah.
to psychiatric medicines. And so,
Yeah.
the example I make is, you could see you could go to a party and have 10 people use the exact same dose of
Yeah.
some drug, and you're going to have 10 different reactions. So nobody can predict, none of us can predict before we start how it's going to impact us. And if it impacts you the wrong way and it's going to do this to your life, why in the hell would you ever start? And
Yeah.
that's my message. That it's all dangerous. I don't ever just talk about fentanyl. I talk about meth. I talk about the super potent THC and alcohol. We're starting to talk about alcohol. I am starting to talk about alcohol a little bit more. Our society's not, but we need to. And some percentage of people, when they go down this road, they just can't stop. And people say, well, prevention doesn't work. I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, every single kid that comes out of my assemblies has more information than they had before they
Yeah.
went in.
Hmm.
And I can't change the single kid's decisions. I'm not going to be there at the party or at the friend's house, when that offer is made. But if I can change their perception of harm from that decision, about that decision, then I believe that a percentage of the kids are going to make smarter choices. And as you well know, every single person, it's cliche to say this, but every single person we can save from going down this road spares a whole lot, that person a lot of pain, and a whole lot of other people a lot of pain.
Oh, absolutely. And education's huge. It's enormous. When I got sober, I went down that road of just trying to figure out the whys and the wherefores. And that saved me. Now, not everybody needs to know all the way back to do I have an attachment disorder or whatever. It was helpful for me to understand the hole in my soul or whatever and all that stuff and work through figuring out what was I trying to replace, what was I doing? But and then with the addiction, skyrocketing throughout my whole family to understand, even just doing like a genogram with a kid, like, hey, look, do you see that half of your family, has got these issues with addiction? And if you try it, guess what's going to happen? You've got a 50-50 shot, right? And so as opposed to maybe a 20-90 shot or something like that. And I feel like that's a huge piece of information, is educating kids on A, there is a genetic predisposition, and B, if you try it and you feel like you have arrived and and everything's better, that's a sign. And we don't tell kids that. Nobody told me that the minute I tried alcohol, I would feel like I have arrived. And maybe if somebody said if it has that type of an effect on you, there's a good chance that you could develop a substance use disorder, and I think that even just that little bit of education can be super, super life changing.
Well, you're right. I mean, everything we give the kids is another piece of information, another tool they have. And the kids deserve, in my opinion, a lot
Yeah.
more than I can give them. They deserve multiple sessions over time, than just 1 hour, like a 90-minute or 1 hour session that I can give. But what I
Yeah.
do argue is what I do is infinitely better than nothing. So the people that criticize my work and disparage my work, that's my standard marketing frame. Well, what I do is better than nothing. And that's the reality is that for most of our kids, we are doing nothing for them nationally. There are certain school districts in certain places, for whatever reason, that have invested in prevention programs, but the majority of our kids are not getting regular and impactful, you know, straight up information about drug abuse. And I find that to be kind of a sin in our society with all the suffering that's going on.
Yeah.
When I started in DEA, we were losing 10,000 beautiful people a year to drug overdose. Now it's almost 10,000 a month.
Oh my
And I'll point out
gosh.
to the kids that's 300 a day, and then I'll say, "Hey, and that's about a dozen during the time I'm talking to you." And I see their eyes. These are middle schoolers or elementary schools. Their eyes open up. A dozen
Yeah.
people will die during my assembly. Because at some point they thought they could mess around with drugs and they discovered that they can't. And so my entire message is one of empowerment. I tell the kids from the beginning, you are the architect of your destiny. You are uniquely responsible for your happiness and your success, whatever your conditions in life are now. I can't change that, but I can change how you think about the choices you have. And the kids
Mm.
love it. I mean, I've gone to 15 different countries. I've taught very different cultures. I'm fluent in Spanish. I'll be in Mexico tonight, teaching in a high school tomorrow. And then
Oh my
actually I'm
gosh.
teaching at Mexico's National Institute of Genetic Research on Friday. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about, well, a lot about what I do normally, but also bringing up epigenetics. And epigenetics for me is a fascinating field. And that's a conversation around, our DNA is fixed, but how
Hmm.
our genes activate and manifest in our development is impacted by stress and nutrition, and certainly by drug exposure. And so
Yeah.
that's really fascinating to me that, the kids are exposed in uterus through the mother's drug and alcohol consumption.
Hmm.
That can actually change how the science now is that can actually change how those genes respond and how those people develop. And certainly teenagers who are drinking and drugging are at great risk of changing how their bodies actually develop. And so it's a new field of study. I'm hardly an expert in it, but I find it fascinating, and it attracts me. It seems logical to me that if we're going to poison ourselves during our development, we're going to change
Yeah.
our development.
Right. Well, and the neurology of it as well, just the neurons and all that stuff is huge, education for kids because your brain is changing. I
Well,
mean, I would have loved
what
to.
age did you start using? What age did you start using
So I
heavily?
was 14, right?
Yeah.
And I started smoking pot, and geez, if somebody, I'm almost done with an MS in addiction counseling. And so I had to do all the, the neuropsychology, all that stuff. And at 50 years old, I'm looking at this going, like all the memory problems and like I
Mhm.
struggle with short-term memory and and I just think, man, I don't know if it would have changed back then. I'm not sure, if there's anything anybody could have said, but I do think that there's a lot of people in general, and at least parents that could educate their kids on, like, hey, you're at this point, your brain is developing. And when you can physically show them, like, now we've got a lot of brain imaging, and you could say, this is what happens. This is what happens in your brain, and if you continue to use this when your brain's developing, it is going to have long-term effects. And marijuana has long-term effects as well. People think that it doesn't, and now that it's legal, they're finding more and more problems with it.
Oh no, I mean, that's what I said. I refuse to talk just about if I go to a school about fentanyl. If I go to a school in a middle school or high school in San Diego and I say, "What's your biggest drug problem?" and the administrators will scream vaping, they'll like yell it because it's a scourge for them.
Yeah.
And I point, well, that's true because that's what you're seeing and that's a problem. But
Mhm.
my bigger concern is some percentage of your student population is willing to take that pill, that the
Yeah.
friend offers them. So, there's different optics on what the bigger problem is. But no, the science goes back years, Jody, on how damaging marijuana is to the developing brain. And I remember there was an interview with a famous doctor in charge of some National Institute of Health here in the United States. And years ago, somebody asked him about the development consequences of marijuana. And his answer was amazing. He said, well, yeah, I wish people would take the developmental consequences of cannabis use, more into account before they use or something. And this was talking about teenage use and youth use.
Yeah.
This is a man who had the power to block products. Like if a corporation produced some food supplement that was found to damage teen development, this guy would have
Yeah.
moved heaven and earth to ban that. But when it comes to marijuana, he's like, well, yeah, people should probably think more about it before they start using it. If anything, the marijuana has just gotten more dangerous, more potent. The
Yeah.
THC levels are now 90% plus. Kids they're buying the concentrates, the tinctures, like these
Oh,
syrups, and mixing it with soda.
oh my
My
gosh.
daughter's a cop in Idaho, and she's a patrol officer, and she was working in a high school, and a kid had a full psychotic breakdown, a
Yeah.
15-year-old, just on weed.
Mhm.
And she sent me the body cam video, and this kid's screaming out of his mind. And his friends came up to her afterwards and said, "Yeah, he was vaping THC."
Yeah.
And the people who don't have the psychotic breakdowns, they argue and say, "Well, marijuana doesn't do that." Well, good. I'm glad it didn't do that for you. But the number one group of people I've discovered who are opposed to marijuana legalization are emergency room physicians. Talk to
Yeah.
them about what they're seeing now with the babies and the children and the young adults coming in with these severe medical and psychiatric consequences from cannabis use.
Oh, yeah, I just talked to a guy that he was getting sick. There's some kind of a stomach flu type thing that it brings on, and he was physically sick and vomiting for months and months. Found out it was the marijuana,
It's
and
called
there's a name for it.
cannabis hyperemesis, and
Yeah.
the chronic use messes up the smooth muscles in your gut. And a friend of mine
Mhm.
works in the emergency room here, and she calls it scromiting. And she says it's the only disease that she can diagnose by hearing it. When these young kids are wheeled into the emergency room, they're screaming and vomiting at the same time because of their chronic cannabis use. And she goes up to them and says, "Look, you've got to stop using the THC. The only way we can help you is to stop." And the patients go, "Well, but that's my medicine." Right? So she has a wonderful way of
Right.
describing it. She's trying to tell people this medicine is creating you an emergency room visit to the hospital and this
Yeah.
agony that you're in. But they're so convinced that they're not harming themselves with it. So, again, my goal is I'm very much on the front. I stay away from a lot of the hot wire topics people are dealing with. I'm about getting information to kids, early and before they need it. And if anybody opposes what I do, I look them square in the face and go, why? How could you possibly oppose what I'm doing?
That
Because
makes
I
no
don't I
sense.
don't see a logical reason to oppose it. Maybe it's very ineffective. Maybe I am not saving a lot of kids, but we have to try. And Jody, if we don't try, look at as bad things are now. If we don't seriously start trying to educate our population away from using this stuff, where are we going to be in 5 years? Look how quickly this is evolving already in
I
front of
know.
us.
I know. I know, and that was kind of what I was gonna ask you, like, where are we with not just fentanyl, but drugs in general? Because well, so, like, we part-time spend a lot of time in Oregon, and it's everything's legal there now. That's my understanding. And so, we're getting to the I feel like we're heading towards everything's just gonna be legal, you know?
I don't know. I mean, I can't say how that would work out. Again,
Mhm.
like I said, there's no actual political will right now for that, and I don't
No,
see
it's
any.
all legal in Oregon. All
Decriminalize is
drugs.
different. Decriminalize is different from legal.
Okay.
And there's some studies that have come out, and I'm not paying close attention to Oregon, but I've seen
Mhm.
some studies coming out saying it's not going very well. that the benefits that were promised from decriminalization haven't been manifesting. And again, I'm not an expert
Oh,
in that. I'm not arguing that. I'm
yeah.
just saying I'm reading some academics are saying, yeah, wait, not so fast. And when I've met people and I see what OxyContin smoking or crack smoking or fentanyl smoking or meth, what it does to them,
Hmm.
I can't in good conscience support legalizing that. And certainly can't do it
Yeah.
until we do this basic thing of teaching our population don't use it. And what's so amazing to me, and I can't stop repeating this, where is that conversation? And
Right.
when we look back at what we did to prevent cigarette smoking, education was at least 50% of that effort in the schools every year, teaching our kids the harm from cigarettes. And it took decades to change the culture. It's taken us decades to get where we are, Jody. I mean, maybe it's going to take us decades to work out of this. But if people think there's a quick fix, if they think somehow legalization is going to solve the problem, they're not paying attention. And another example I'll use: those 10 years I spent investigating prescription drug abuse for DEA, those are legal drugs. OxyContin was a legal drug,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And the country lost its mind for it. And look
Hmm.
what happened. This legal drug that you could get under controlled circumstances, and people lost their minds for it. So if you're going to legalize fentanyl or legalize meth, well, then you get into, okay, how much do you give out? Who do you give it to? What age do you give it at? How do you deal with the consequences? Who's responsible for the health consequences? So there's a lot of actually like real world complications in the concept of truly legalizing these things.
Well, and cigarettes kill more people worldwide than anyone, followed by alcohol, if my statistics are right, and those are both legal substances. Now we're
Right.
having more problems with marijuana, so to me, it's like when you legalize it, then it creates a situation where now you have people that would do it illegally would do it, but then other people that, "Oh, well, it's legal, so it's fine." Well, no, it's not. So to me, I'm with you. I think it would just make it worse, and then we'd have even worse than it is now, you
I'm
know?
just not there yet. I mean, my thing is, until this society, I will never change my mind. Until this society gets
Yeah,
its head out of its butt and says, you know
right.
what, we need to try to educate all of our kids to give them the information. I mean, I think it's cruel. I think it's cruel what we're doing to our kids.
Yeah.
When I work in the juvenile halls in San Diego, those angry young incarcerated teenagers, and they hate me when I show up. They let me know it. They hate me. And I ignore the verbal abuse and the flipping off and everything. And I
Yeah.
give my presentation. And when I'm done, it's different because by the end of my presentation, those young guys understand what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to prevent them. It's not an accident that a 15-year-old ends up in prison. What was done to that person or not done for them as a child? And
Yeah.
almost all of that was straight line connection to drug abuse. And they get it. They just get it. And so, but it's the culture. As dangerous as the drug situation today is, our popular culture hasn't changed. We're still telling kids it's fun, it's normal, it's part of being an adolescent, and you should experience it too.
Well, and be sure to wear your mask and get your vaccine, but cool if you wanna stick a needle in your arm. That's what I don't get. It's like the priorities. It's like, at least make some sense. You know?
Yeah, I mean,
Anyway,
but
that's
we lost 12 high school students in San Diego, 18 and
oh
under, to
my
fentanyl last year in a county. We didn't lose 12 kids to school shootings. But I make this example. If we had some human who was stalking teenagers, right? If we had a serial
yeah.
murderer who once a month was killing a teenager walking home from high school or something, we would educate every single child. It'd be full stop. We would educate every single child. Hey, look out for this guy. This is the vehicle we think he drives. This is what we think he looks like. With drugs, and I think there's a sad stigma. I think really as a society, we stigmatize the users and we even little kids
Yeah.
because otherwise I can't explain the lack of reaction.
Mhm.
I can't explain how we're not reacting with more proactive steps to protect the kids, and we're not.
Is this changing a little bit with fentanyl? Are you getting more calls and more invites into schools or not?
Well, fentanyl, no. The rainbow fentanyl,
Yeah, I was
yes.
gonna
So
ask what's going on with this candy stuff. And I'm talking to people more down south where, because here we're in Reno and it's starting to roll in, but it's not like there where they're saying stuff that a lot of people here don't believe. And I'm like, no, they had an overdose on Halloween that like it is getting in chewing gum. I mean, I had a mom say or a guy say it got into gum. I'm like, I mean, these guys and some of these guys that are getting sober from fentanyl, like they're saying, no, it is in everything. That's what they're saying. I've had 2 and 3 people say it's in everything.
Well,
Obviously, I take that with a grain of salt, but you know what I mean.
no, but look, it's not the marijuana industry is. I mean, the drug industry is not a corporation. It's a bunch of freelancers, and so there's
Yeah.
always going to be some person out there trying to get a competitive advantage over their competitors. I work with a program called Teen Challenge. It's a Christian
Yep. I
recovery
love
program,
them.
and yeah, me too. And they require their clients to give testimonials. So years ago, these young men would accompany me to schools, and several of them admitted to me that they would mix meth into the joints they were selling without telling their customers.
Yeah.
And they would
Yeah.
get their clients, teenage clients, hooked on meth because there wasn't much money selling weed, but there was money selling meth. And so that's the mind. People don't want to understand that you can buy the powdered fentanyl from, if you can get it on the dark web, you can buy it directly, or you buy the powdered stuff that comes in from Mexico, and you can remanufacture that however you want. But the cartels started out faking the roxycodone, the blues. Now everybody calls them perks. They're not perks. They're Roxys. And then we saw, it's in Xanax, it's in Vicodin, it's in all these other
Hmm.
products.
Yeah.
Now the multicolored pills, which people call rainbow, I don't. They're just multicolored. That tells
Right.
me something very powerful. That tells me that the cartels realize they don't have to trick Americans anymore. That is a very sad shift because they're not faking these pills. They come out of the same machines. They have the same M30 markings on them, but they're pink and green, and which tells me that they know Americans want fentanyl and they're straight up selling them fentanyl. And the
Oh my
prices on these things
gosh.
continues to plummet. The price of meth continues to plummet. Our indigenous communities now are being shredded by fentanyl. And there was a study from UCLA late last year, early this year, talking about the increase in overdose death in our Native American communities. And
Yeah.
they're going to spend millions studying it. I'm like, I don't need millions. I mean, this stuff has gotten so inexpensive that even our most economically disadvantaged communities now are able to get as much fentanyl as they want.
So it's
And it's not
cheap,
going
easy
away.
to yeah, it's cheap, it's small, like a couple grains of salt, so it sounds like that's what's happening. It's cheap, easy to make, and easy to transport. Is that really why it's we're seeing this? Because I mean, fentanyl's been around since the '50s. People use it, in doctors' offices. So it's one of those things where why are we seeing this now?
Well,
This
it's
massive
Sam,
epidemic
a guy
now?
named an author named Sam Quinones wrote a great book called Dreamland.
Uh-huh.
And the book Dreamland talks about what happened. And the cartels in Mexico were producing their heroin, their traditional, brown
Right.
tar heroin from Mexico. And
Mhm.
they discovered if they added fentanyl to it, it was kind of a booster. So they were selling this sort of boosted heroin years ago, 7 or 8, 9 years ago.
Mm,
And
okay.
and fentanyl is really heroin's actually very expensive and hard to produce. Fentanyl is very cheap and easy to get, or was
Got
much
it.
easier then.
Mhm.
So they were adding fentanyl, and just over time, through economics, they realized they didn't have to sell heroin anymore. And I mean, years ago, I called the Buffalo PD in New York to talk about an investigation, and I asked the cop that I was talking to, "Hey, what are you seeing as far as heroin?" And he told me this is years ago. He goes, "Rocky, every sample of heroin we buy is actually fentanyl." Because it's incredibly inexpensive. So now, they're just producing the fentanyl. You don't need thousands of acres of opium poppies. You don't have to pay the farmers. You don't have to transport the
Right.
chemicals. You just import the industrial chemicals to your underground laboratory somewhere, and you produce as much of this stuff as you want. And the fake pills, the blues, used to wholesale for $10 in San Diego, and then a couple years ago it was $6 a pill. And then it was $3 a pill. And recently I heard from a former DEA colleague, there's somebody offering these things for 50 cents a pill.
Oh my gosh.
And so, you can buy a pill for 50 cents and sell it for 5, and you made 1,000% profit. And you can't do that with Coke or meth or any of the other drugs. So you can still make incredible, insane profits selling fentanyl.
Well, and it's so deadly. It seems odd that these dealers would be targeting kids because it's so deadly. Like that seems like it would be bad for business if such a small amount could kill a child. That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I don't know that they're targeting little kids, but I mean, ecstasy's always been coming in these beautiful, colorful pills, for a
Yeah,
reason.
that's true.
It is attracted, it's marketed to a younger audience. There's a new hideous drug called 2CB,
Oh
a
my
new synthetic
gosh.
mix of drugs being made by some people in Colombia. And there's a wonderful interview on Vice TV of this woman making this stuff. And she goes, "Yeah, we make it pink and it sells better." So it just simply making the drug look less scary increases sales. So you make
Got
these
it.
pretty pastel colored fentanyl pills, and people's perception of harm drops. And then, of course, I've never lived in addiction, but I spent a lot of years dealing with people who did, and people who've never been in addiction don't understand.
Right.
And me as a cop, when I was dealing with the Vicodin addicted population, Vicodin/heroin addicted population years ago, and I would read about several overdoses in a community in San Diego, and I would talk to these witnesses of mine, and I say, "Doesn't that scare you away from using these opioids. And their response was, Rocky, the first thing it makes me think of, how do I get on the trolley to get to that community to buy that strong dope? Right.
That is, and that's the weirdest thing, because I talked to a guy that's sober from fentanyl, and he said the same thing. Well, first he said he was getting heroin, and then all of a sudden it was different. Years later, it was just different, and then he knew it was fentanyl. By then he was hooked, and he had originally gotten hooked because he had cancer and got the pain med. So the whole thing where it went to the
Mm.
oxy, or the opiate prescription, then the heroin, then the fentanyl. But he said, yeah, I'd go to this dealer, and this dealer would brag to me about, I got the crap that killed X, Y, and Z, and he was like, wow, give me some of that. And I'm like, that's some crazy logic, but I've been in addiction, and so I can kind of see that, where you're like, wow, that must be really potent shit. Give me. I mean, I could see
Yeah.
that. It's crazy. It's crazy to me now. But I could see that. Well, talk to me. Gosh, we've been on for a while. Talk to me about kids and how they're getting it. Maybe the Snapchat, the internet. What's going on for parents? How do we educate kids on just being targeted for fentanyl and
Well,
other drugs?
parents are checked out. I mean, I'll do parent events for local school districts, and parents, statistically, they don't participate. So, my preferred
Wow.
audience is the kids as a captive audience in the schools.
Mhm.
But it's the years ago, we saw it with the texting and the phones. I mean, the drug dealers were managing their customer base through the phones. It was really fun. 10 or so years ago in San Diego, we would arrest some local drug dealer, and you're not supposed to do it anymore, but we would open their phone and we would send messages out to all their customers pretending to be the drug dealer and say, hey, come load up. And then the people would show up to, buy drugs from us.
Uh-huh.
But then social media has just, doubled and tripled down on that. And
Yeah.
any young person now who wants to explore the world of drug abuse has instant access to hideous drug sites that are run by PhD chemists who love drug abuse, that'll tell those kids, allegedly what they can use, what they can combine it with, what the synergistic effects are, how much you can supposedly safely use. And then there's a whole subculture that's marketing this stuff over the internet. So, it's very difficult for law enforcement, because historically we had a supply chain. You'd arrest some person in the middle of that supply chain, and then you could work up or down that chain. Now the stuff's being shipped around the world and paid
Mhm.
for, through Bitcoin and
Oh my
digital methods.
gosh.
And so I'm going to work up in Boise. Some of the schools in Boise are bringing me up there in January, and they're hearing
Mhm.
about fentanyl, and some people up there don't think it's a problem. But the problem is, it takes one student. One
Yeah.
student can have a family member with a connection, or one student can discover some internet connection, and all of a sudden you've got a huge supply of fentanyl coming into a community that's never
Mm.
experienced it. So again, the world around drug abuse and drug dealing is so radically different, and yet as a society, we're not adapting adequately. We're still treating it in some ways like it was the problem 20 years ago. And the
Yeah.
numbers of dead and the numbers in addiction and the number of suffering just continues to climb. And I can't tolerate it.
You got that whole the DEA wall is so sad, all the deaths from fentanyl. And I read about the one kid. I mean, there's been a few of them, but he just good kid, thought he was getting a Xanax, ordered it on Snapchat, 2 in the morning, showed up, got it it didn't even make it out of his driveway before he collapsed. Parents were asleep because it was 2 in the morning, and he died. And I mean, I feel like, why are we not talking about this? Like, this
I
is
know
crazy.
you're right. And there's still kids. I've talked to 20,000 kids locally since July 1st. That's a lot. I'm tired. I'm taking a little break, and I'll get back to it after the new year. But, I'm talking to the kids and they don't know. I mean, some
Yeah,
do, but with such a serious public health problem, to me, I'm not a religious guy, but it's a sin. It's a moral failing of our society that we're not making sure that every single kid from like 11 years old and on understands what the super powerful marijuana can do to them, what alcohol can do to them, and certainly what the pills can do to them. And if and we talk about death, but there's for everybody who dies from an overdose, there are maybe dozens who don't, who survive
exactly.
and revive and continue to abuse. And for everybody who lives in addiction, and I call it suffering in addiction, everybody who's suffering in addiction, there's a circle of friends and family who are suffering with them. So
Yep.
the true number of Americans in enormous pain daily is
Mhm.
millions.
Yeah,
And again, our society is not standing up saying, time out, enough. We're not going to accept this anymore. And we're accepting that this half our kids are depressed and sad. We're accepting these huge increases in overdose death. And our solution is we're going to declare war on the drug cartels instead of
yeah.
actually cleaning up our own house first.
Mhm,
And I don't get it,
mhm.
And I'll tell you what, one of the reasons I got into this work in 2007, 2008, 2009, we were arresting a large number of young adults in San Diego from upper class areas, good communities, and kids who got hooked on Oxy when it was $80 a pill.
Yeah.
Poorer communities we didn't see Oxy abuse in the poor communities because the kids couldn't afford it. But these young people who destroyed themselves, and they'd be in handcuffs and we're about to take them to jail. And I would ask them questions like, when did you start? Why did you start? And in tears, they would say, many of them, if only somebody would have warned me. If only somebody would have told me how bad it was going to be, I wouldn't have started. And I would look at them and say, would you actually listen to me? But I heard that enough, Jody, that I suddenly said, okay, I'm that guy.
Yeah.
So that's really what's behind what I'm doing now. I'm that guy. And I tell the kids in my audiences, I'm here with a simple purpose, ladies and gentlemen, to change you all.
Yeah.
And none of you, after today's assembly, not one of you can ever tell yourself or anybody else that you didn't know what this is going to do to you before you started using it. And the kids, I'll do these 90-minute assemblies, and the kids are cheering and clapping afterwards, and they get it. I'm putting it on their hands. I'm not going to be there, guys. You need to be there. You need to be looking out for yourselves and for your friends. This is not high-tech stuff that I'm doing.
Right. No, but that's awesome. We need more warriors like you, That's what I'm trying to do too, It's just like we gotta talk about it. I meet people and I'm like, how you doing? I saw another guy, we were on the Oregon coast and he kept falling asleep in his van. And I thought, is he overdosing? I had the same thing in Vegas where people were laying on the street and nobody even paid attention. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to see if he's like, dude, are you okay? Have you been doing any opiates? Are you, we got to just go there with people. Or when I meet people that, are you drinking? How have you been, and they're always like, whoa, because they can't believe I'm asking them. I don't care. If it's going to save your life, let's talk about it.
Well, I did a parent event, a community event locally here a week or so ago, and there's a lovely woman, Amy Neville, whose young son passed away, and she's become quite a verbal advocate, for education and prevention about fentanyl. And they were giving out Narcan at the event.
Yeah.
And she made a good point. She says, you get a box of it with 2 packages, 2 doses.
You got it in my purse.
You can so you can punch a hole in it and put it in your keychain. So I've started doing that, So 2 days ago, I punched a hole in a Narcan and I carry it on my keychain now because I'm not worried about my daughters. I've worked really hard to educate them, and I'm not.
Yeah.
I never zero risk, but low risk with my kids. But I'm in the world where I don't want to find somebody who's blue, and not be able to give them a chance to survive long enough for the paramedics to get there. So, and again, as bad as it is today, look at the trends. We're going to be very sad in 5 years if we don't start doing something serious now.
Yeah, that's true. That is so true. I got to ask you this one more thing before I let you go. Can people OD on fentanyl from touching someone? We keep hearing about it, and then we see the hazmat suits and the people that some of the people I work with say, no, that's not true. That's not happening. And then I've lost other people that say, oh no, I watched it happen. And I'm like, I don't know, where you touch someone.
Well, the problem is you don't know what you're dealing with.
Okay.
Right? The vast majority of the fentanyl that comes across the border from Mexico is low potency. It's less than 10% in the powder. The pills, they tell me, are down 1 or 2% potency. So you're very unlikely to have any kind of toxic reaction from touching most of the fentanyl that's being sold in America. But you don't know where it came from. One of the guys I investigated in San Diego was a former chemistry professor at Annapolis. And he was buying car fentanyl through the mail, and he died in San Diego smoking, I think, was vaping car fentanyl. And so if you go into an environment where you see a white powder and you think, oh, this is that 10% potent fentanyl, and it turns out to be pure car fentanyl that this idiot just ordered through the dark web, you've got a problem. So, in each individual instance, I'm not going to judge whether somebody had a legitimate exposure or whatever. However, people who declare that you can't have any kind of negative consequence, you're telling me what that substance is, right? So I tell people, look, it's not Ebola. It's not going to jump off the table and kill you, but put on gloves, put on a dust mask, treat it with respect. People talk about CPR on fentanyl victims. Fentanyl, if you touch your lips, it doesn't really absorb through your skin, but it will absorb through your lips and your mucous membrane. So if somebody has snorted fentanyl in a ground pill and snorted it, and somebody else does CPR on them and they've got fentanyl powder around their lips, that rescue breather could have a problem. So
that's probably what happened, because I'd heard about a law enforcement that OD'd on it, and of course then the story travels, and then it turns out he he just touched the guy, but I bet it was something like that. So that makes more sense to
Well,
me.
there was another
Wow.
case I heard about where some officers were searching a vehicle. Highway patrol guys were searching a vehicle, and they found something on the dash, and they pulled on it, and it was a bag of fentanyl. And so there was a cloud of fentanyl, and those guys they didn't overdose. That's the thing. Having a fentanyl reaction,
Mhm.
feeling dizzy, feeling, you've changed,
Right.
is not an overdose.
Right, right.
But so, again, you're not I don't think anybody's going to die from touching, the commercially available illegal fentanyl, but you could have a health consequence. So
Mhm.
just be careful around it. You don't have to panic, but be careful and take some basic precautions. And thankfully, most people aren't having those kind of negative. Most people who are suffering from this are the people who are taking it, either accidentally and dying from a poisoning, we're calling it, or they're
Yeah.
taking it on purpose, knowing it's fentanyl, and they just played the game too many times and end up losing.
Mm. Rocky, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all this information. I could talk to you for another like 2 hours, but I know we both have jobs and stuff to do, but I really appreciate you being here. Is there anything else you want to say in closing, and also let people know how they can get in touch with you in case they want you to come speak at their school?
No, thank you. Yeah. So I have a personal website. It's www.rocky, ROCKY, Herron, HERRON.com. And there's pictures and there's some discussion of my work. There's a few videos of some of my school presentations. I just want people to understand we have to do this. I don't think what I do is magical. I don't think I'm the only person that can do it. But I want help in changing the minds of our school leaders because it's not happening at home.
Yeah.
The messaging kids are getting from the popular culture is all the wrong message. So the only place where we can do meaningful prevention messaging with kids, in my opinion, is in the schools. And as parents, as people who are concerned, you can lobby the school leaders. Go to them and say, "Hey, what are you doing about the drug problem? Are you bringing
Mhm.
anybody in? If not, why? Can I help you find resources?" And I'm pretty sure every community in America has people like me who will provide these services. Grieving families, recovered
Mhm.
people in recovered addiction, different government social service agencies. So the resources are there. The internet's full of educational resources. And
Yeah.
one final message for any parents who are listening: no family's safe. No family is safe. My own kids had some drug problems, minor ones, thank goodness, but they seemed serious at the time.
Mhm.
And that education really has to start at home.
Yeah.
If the kids do get anything at school, it's going to be for an hour in a year where they're surrounded by friends and a culture that tells them to use it. So, take education seriously. And then finally, if you suspect as a parent that your child has a drug abuse problem, do not think you can treat it yourself. Too many families are ashamed. They don't know what to do. They don't reach out. And it's like if your kid had a lump under their body, you wouldn't just say, "Oh, I'm just going to deal with that myself." You take them to an expert. And so if you suspect your child has a drug problem, contact your school counselors. Just contact your school counselors and say, "I don't know what's going on here. If I'm not sure, how can I
Yeah.
try and get my mind around this?" And bring some attention, because too many parents who've lost their kids have told me they wish they'd intervened early. They bought the lies, and then the kid lied to them, and the parents believed it. In today's world, it's hard to make that mistake.
Yeah, yeah, we have to have support. We can't fight this epidemic alone. We can't fight it. We can't fight addiction alone. We can't do anything alone. We need each other. And that is so true. Awesome, Rocky. You've been a great inspiration and a lot of great information. So thank you so much.
No, Jody, a pleasure to meet with you.